as the city of Chicago. And to go back to the city of Chicago, they do enforce that. Like Rico said, I mean, they hold an iron claw on that. But they use it all over, all types. We're seeing a lot more. I'm seeing a lot more. And Emily could probably tell you that, too, from just attending the conference last week we held up here. They use it more of as a pay-as-you-go. With the way the real estate values have dropped all over, particularly in the city of Chicago, you're going to see where they don't really bond stuff anymore. When you generate the increment, you're going to get reimbursed for the eligible reimbursement costs, redevelopment costs.
I guess what I mean is it your sense that some of the problems Ben raised about excessive length of the TIF district life and the arbitrary nature of the distribution of some of these funds and the starving of some public institutions as a result of TIFs, do other areas in Illinois that we're less familiar with have the same problems only on their smaller scale? I mean, I guess the theory for cynics who've covered politics for a lot of years is that really every place is about the same, we just don't hear about it the same way, and it's smaller in scale.
I mean, they all realize the recession, which is still going on, and which will be going on for a while. There's probably a lot of unknown knowledge. Mayor Daley has done a lot for the CPS with schools and all that stuff. I mean, you have a lot where they help with training, no matter where in the state of Illinois. Some capital cost and furtherance of the redevelopment plan. When we had TIF reform in November 1st, 1999, we put the definitions in there of qualification criteria. We put the definition in there, what was an eligible redevelopment cost. We took out of there, which was happening in some parts of the state, where they were doing TIFs for golf course, residential golf courses. You did have that because there was a loose interpretation of what was blight. Corn blight and blight are two different things. I live right next, I have 20 acres next to me. I don't own it. That is in a special service area and part of a TIF. But I tell you, I live in a small community adjacent to the state capitol. I live in Sherman. We just, I've been there 34 years. Thank God for Moose. I look younger than I am. 34 years, and we've been trying to draw a grocery store and a Walgreens or whatever there. And finally, we just now signed a redevelopment agreement with Country Market, which is like a Dominick's, and Walgreens. And Walgreens is a tough sell, and so is Country Market, and they do their feasibility studies. And our mayor, a young, energetic guy, knows TIFs inside and out. And with the TIF attorney that this village of Sherman is using, it was a but-for. I mean, and he can bring out, and the development can bring out a redevelopment agreement to show you, here's the gap financing. And people, you got to realize, if you've never been in business, and I have a construction business on the side, that I haven't built something for 5 years due to a hockey injury and a broken leg. But financing is tough to come by. And, it's a but-for. You got to show the gap, or these communities will not let you participate in a TIF.
So you feel that at least where you live, this has been a good thing to have, a good tool.
I think no matter where you live, even in Chicago, it's a good tool.
Okay.
Period. I mean, you can't say TIFs are bad. I mean, you got to look at the project itself.
Okay, well, that's what I was going to say. So Ben, I know you would have lost hundreds of column opportunities, but do you think the city of Chicago would be how would Chicago be a different place today if there were no TIFs? Would we look the same? Would we look different? Would we look better? What do you think? Is there any way to make that kind of leap?
That's a really tough question to answer, Andy. And Rachel and I actually have had conversation about this in the past because it's really difficult to ascertain with any TIF, the way the TIF program works in Chicago, again, where you collect more money than any specific project that you've you're supposedly allocating the money for. It's really difficult to tell what development would have happened anyway, what development is specifically related to the TIF, and what development is a combination of both. I used to tease one of my favorite aldermen, Bert Nateris, when he was still talking to me, That when you hear Bert Nateras talk about the Central Loop TIF or the downtown development, you would think that but for the TIF, there was just like tumbleweeds blowing through there. And so I was like, I would tease him, Bert, is that traffic light TIF related over there? And he goes, no problem with you. Reporters, you're so cynical. But I think that, like following up on Rachel said, you got to look at the evolution of in downtown development and downtown TIFs. If you really want to understand this problem, again, going back to that Central Loop TIF that she alluded to that was created in 1984 at a very different time from what we have now. Again, that was the TIF in its finest, most abstract moment where at the then mayor, Harold Washington, had a very sharply defined project in mind, and that was the Block 37 project, which in the ensuing 25 years has been a debacle. But his vision was a very specific project, and it says in that original eligibility report that as soon as we're done developing this block, and Block 37, for those who don't know what I'm talking about, is the block that's roughly between, okay, let me do this now, I'm really bad
Randolph and Dearborn Upstate.
and he is good at this. And, right, you know the block.
I'm sorry, Randolph and Washington Upstate.
Randolph, Washington State, Dearborn, right. Okay, so that block, they bought up, they used property tax dollars to buy up all the property, and then they used property tax dollars to tear down all the existing buildings, and then they sold it at less than market value to a collection of real estate developers who were incapable of getting a project off the ground. Mayor Daley inherited that project. He then bought back the property at a far greater price than he had sold it to the original developers because they couldn't do it and they felt as though that they needed to get back whatever costs they had put into it. And then he sold it for less to a second group of developers who were incapable of developing it. And I think it's now a third group of developers who are suing each other who now have it. It's 2/3 constructed of what they originally said they were going to do. So this is, okay, I would argue that it has not worked. And that's their pet project. They talk about the Central Loop TIF as though that's the greatest example of TIF in its creation. It's a debacle. Now, then they took the Central Loop TIF, having done such a marvelous job with Block 37, and in 1996 they expanded it so it's even bigger and diverts even more money. And they moved it a little to the north and moved it a little to the east on the grounds that these were blighted communities. Follow me where we are right now with the blighted communities. We're roughly at Michigan Avenue and Lake Street, the blighted, poor section of Chicago.
Wait a minute. I worked for ABC at State and Lake. Was I in a blighted neighborhood?
I believe that building actually got TIF funds. Don't quote me on that one. If they didn't, they're one of the few in that area who didn't. And that TIF, that expanded TIF, was there when Mayor Daley needed to scoop up and get some money to build Millennium Park. So you could argue in the abstract, 30 years later, what a genius Harold Washington was to create the Central Loop TIF, because it ended up in subsidizing Millennium Park. So then you could say, okay, it worked. Why then, in 2006, did Mayor Daley have to go back to the city council to ask for the creation of the LaSalle Central TIF, which is the TIF just west of the Central Loop, the original Central Loop TIF, which was the one that did such a whiz-bang job of fixing up Block 37. We now have a TIF for the western part of the loop that's east of Wacker Drive, which includes such dilapidated blocks as the one where Willis Tower is. So I would argue that if the Central Loop TIF did, as Alderman Nateras has been telling me it has, a great job of developing the loop, then there is no reason to call the western part of the loop, the part that's just across the street from Block 37, blighted. So why do you need LaSalle Central? I would consider these are common sense questions that should have been posed and in the summer of 2006 when at least 3 different oversight bodies, Andy, were considering LaSalle Central, the Joint Review Commission, the Community Development Commission, and of course, my favorite, the Chicago City Council. And that TIF just rumbled to approval without hardly any questions being asked. I would say that's the biggest debacle TIF of the last 10 years because, again, if the Central Loop TIF did such a great job, why would you need a TIF next door? The good news is that I think we've come a little further as a city in terms of our understanding of the TIF. Back in 2006, 2007, I was forever looking for aldermanic candidates who would speak out in opposition to this horrendous proposal with the LaSalle Central TIF. And generally, the interviews went a little like this, where I would say, what do you think about that TIF? And they would say something to me along the lines, could you just explain to me how this thing works again? Now we're at the point where I'm getting calls from candidates who are saying, I have this TIF reform agenda. Would you write about me? TIFs are an outrage. We should ban them. So I like to be optimistic, and I feel as a city we're a little further along than we were.
Well, okay, before I get to the question of what we do now,